The Valley of the Kings, Egypt. February 16, 1923. A British excavation team led by archaeologist Howard Carter enters an underground ancient Egyptian burial chamber. Once inside, they break a protective seal that guards the tomb of King Tutankhamun.
Carter lifts up a lamp and they look through and see that Tutankhamun is buried with this fantastic array of more than 5,000 objects. The room is absolutely full to bursting with gold and precious stones and various other precious and valuable items, more or less exactly in place as they'd been left more than 3,000 years ago.
Of the thousands of wondrous artifacts found in King Tut's tomb, perhaps the most extraordinary is an exquisitely forged 13-inch iron dagger.
The dagger is a really sensational object with a golden sheath which is decorated with a chased feather pattern. It was placed on the thigh of the king, and of all the 5,000 objects in the tomb, the vast majority of them were nowhere near as close as that to the very body of the king. So this is something very, very important.
King Tut's reign was about 1330 BC. At that time, King Tut's dagger was a very important piece, as a symbol that the gods handed him this power. And that's why the iron dagger was buried with King Tut. He needed it on his journey to the afterlife.
In the afterlife, King Tut was charged with the very important mission of assisting the sun god Ra. Ancient Egyptians believed that when the sun set every day, Ra would traverse the underworld, which was a dark, murky, watery place, fraught with dangers and demons and beasts. So King Tut would use this dagger to literally defend and fight off these hordes of enemies. And so there's this belief that the blade of the dagger had miraculous and spiritual powers.
The idea that King Tut was buried with a mighty iron dagger to vanquish foes in the afterlife is certainly a great story. But is it possible that the dagger actually possesses divine power as the ancient Egyptians believed? Perhaps the answer lies in the mysterious origins of this sacred relic.
The Egyptians had essentially no ability in smelting iron at the time of Tutankhamun, and so the iron from this dagger that Tutankhamun was buried with, it comes from elsewhere. The Egyptians, of course, thought that the only reasonable explanation for the presence of a very exquisitely, perfectly worked iron dagger was that the iron itself was some kind of gift directly from the gods. We now know, however, thanks to very recent scientific analysis, that the iron doesn't come from iron ore in the ground. It is meteoric iron, which comes from a meteorite landing on Earth from space.
For Egyptians, the sky is where the gods were. So you have to understand, at that time in ancient Egypt, 3,500 years ago, a meteorite falling on Earth with iron in it, and piece of it looked like a dagger. Symbolically, that piece of iron was a gift from the gods for the ancient Egyptians.
Did the ancient Egyptians believe that King Tut's dagger had otherworldly powers because it literally came from another world? Perhaps. But some people think that the sacred nature of this relic was more than just symbolic. As evidence, they point to a series of mysterious deaths that took place after archaeologists removed the dagger from King Tut's tomb.
There's the moment where Howard Carter's archaeological team peers into an undiscovered tomb and sees loads of gold and treasure. And then, shortly after Carter's sponsor, the Earl of Carnarvon, dies relatively suddenly in unusual, surprising circumstances.
The Earl of Carnarvon's cause of death was reportedly a mysterious form of blood poisoning, and he died only 4 months after the tomb had been opened. All told, 7 members of the expedition unexpectedly died in the years after King Tut's dagger was removed from his sarcophagus. Many believe that tampering with the dagger had unlocked a deadly curse, and that the untimely deaths were proof of the weapon's otherworldly power.
If the dagger's there for the king's protection, and the point at which the dagger is removed by a clumsy, unsuspecting, unbelieving archaeologist, that's the moment at which some nastiness befalls the archaeologist. Then I think if you believe in the curse, perhaps the dagger is centrally important to that.
On the bottom of our planet lies the frigid land of Antarctica, the coldest and most inhospitable continent in the world. Stretching over 5 million square miles, Antarctica is covered in ice sheets that reach more than a mile deep. The average daily temperature is negative 49 degrees Fahrenheit, and wind speeds can reach over 100 miles per hour. Today, the only inhabitants of this barren landscape are scientists who work in research stations scattered across the continent. Mainstream geologists have long believed that ancient humans never settled on Antarctica because of its hostile climate. But incredibly, in 2016, satellite images revealed a curious formation emerging from the ice that some researchers believe could be a man-made pyramid.
Recently, there have been a number of reports of pyramids, huge great pyramids in Antarctica. They jut out of the ice and snow, and they look perfect, just like those in Egypt. But they dwarf those in Egypt, like the Great Pyramid. One has a perfectly square base that is 2 kilometres square in each direction. Is it possible, therefore, that our ancestors did actually reach the Antarctic continent and perhaps even settle there?
A man-made pyramid beneath the Antarctic ice? If such an incredible notion is true, then it naturally begs some questions. How was such a massive structure built on Antarctica? When was it done? And by whom?
Antarctica, we have been told from the geologists, has been under ice for many millions of years. However, there is evidence that it could have been free of ice, certainly in certain areas, until perhaps 4000 BC. There are a large number of stories from Polynesia of so-called culture heroes who reached the Antarctic continent. A French academic by the name of Argon put together all of these different stories in a book titled Out of Antarctica. The Polynesian people's stories describe this strange land with these white rocks that come out of the water, which are icebergs, and other creatures such as seals and penguins, and seem to describe an area that we now know as Antarctica. The Polynesian peoples believed this was the place of the ancestors. And they said, this is where we came from originally. Why did they believe this, if this was untrue?
Is it really possible that the coldest place on Earth was once warm enough to be inhabited by humans? Well, in 2017, German geologists collected core samples from deep within the frozen Antarctic seafloor in order to analyze what the continent's climate might have been like thousands of years ago. What they discovered was astonishing.
In the case of that expedition in early 2017, we used a very special seafloor drill rig that hasn't been used before in Antarctica. So when we used this special drill rig and the sediments came up, we saw immediately more than 60 different taxa of plants, similar to something that you would find in a rainforest, in a temperature regime that was similar to what we today know from northern Italy. And finding that on the Antarctic continent, that was the most exciting thing, because the climatic conditions doesn't today allow any vegetation to survive under those conditions. So based on that location and the environment we found, I think that the Antarctic continent and the secrets that still need to be recovered will tell us a lot about planet Earth.
Cairo, Egypt. Sitting atop a plateau just a few miles west of the Nile River is the Giza necropolis, perhaps the most famous collection of ruins in the entire world. Believed to be constructed during ancient Egypt's 4th dynasty, around 2550 BC, these limestone monuments attract thousands of tourists every day who come to marvel at the immense pyramids, forbidding tombs, and a mysterious stone sentinel known as the Sphinx.
I think you can argue that the Sphinx is the most recognizable statue anywhere in the world. Its scale is immense. It's one single piece of stone. It is cut from the natural rock of the Giza Plateau.
The Sphinx stands 240 feet long, 66 feet tall, and 62 feet wide. For thousands of years, this massive statue has been an object of both fascination and wonder. But even after centuries of study, the Sphinx holds many secrets that archaeologists are still trying to unravel.
The Sphinx that we know today, the Sphinx from the Great Pyramids of Giza, is the most famous of all sphinxes. But there are sphinxes all over ancient Egypt. There are smaller sphinxes. There's an avenue full of sphinxes between the temples.
But the Great Sphinx at Giza is something very different. It's a single sculpture. It sits in a very particular place. It doesn't seem to have performed the same function at all. What was it for? This is what we really want to know.
No one has understood exactly what it means, because for literally thousands of years, the Sphinx was buried up to its neck in sand. So it's only a head sticking out of the sand for much of its history.
There is a very famous painting of Emperor Napoleon standing in front of the Sphinx, buried still at this point up to its shoulders. You might think, what has Napoleon got to do with Egypt and the Sphinx? Well, in fact, Napoleon led an invasion of Egypt in 1798, which had a big impact back in Europe in raising awareness and interest in ancient Egypt sites.
It wasn't until the 1920s that a team of archaeologists, led by engineer Émile Barrès, succeeded in unearthing the Sphinx from the desert sands.
They were able to expose it and to reveal for the first time in centuries that this was not just a head, a disembodied head, but a full Sphinx sculpture. And this is a watershed moment for us understanding the Sphinx.
Archaeologists and Egyptologists like myself believe that the Sphinx was sculpted around 2500 BC by King Khephren as a part of his funerary complex. But a lot of scholars disagree about the Sphinx, and there's a lot of mystery surrounding when was the Sphinx actually sculpted.
One of the most important documents we have to do with the dating of the Sphinx is the inventory stela. This is a commemorative stone that actually records details of how the pharaoh Khufu repaired the Sphinx after it was struck by lightning. The significance of this is that Khufu came before Khafre, the pharaoh who is conventionally said to have constructed the Sphinx.
The inventory stela has an inscription that goes back to about 4,600 years ago. And that inscription says that the Sphinx is a much older structure that the Egyptians adopted and repaired and venerated.
Based on the inscriptions on the inventory stela, there are some archaeologists who believe that the Sphinx is so ancient that it could predate any records in human history that are known to exist. And some researchers are convinced that physical evidence of the Sphinx's true age can be found on the structure itself.
The first time I visited the Sphinx was in the summer of 1990. My early studies of the Sphinx looked at the erosional features on the body of the Sphinx and comparing that to other erosional features right on the Giza Plateau. And what I found was the body of the Sphinx and the walls of the Sphinx enclosure are weathered differently than everything else on the Giza Plateau. The rest of the plateau shows classic wind erosion, but what is on the Sphinx is water weathering. It's rainfall, precipitation, and this makes no sense when the Sphinx is sitting on the edge of the Sahara Desert that has been a bone-dry desert for literally thousands of years. So what I concluded is that the body of the Sphinx, and therefore the original statue, had to go back to pre-Sahara times, when there was a much more temperate climate, much more moisture, much more rainfall, and it has to go back not just a little bit into that period, but quite far back, given that we have incredible amount of weathering and erosion on the Sphinx. I now think that it goes back to the end of the last ice age, circa 10,000 BC. I am convinced that it is a ruin from pre-dynastic Egypt.
The Valley of the Kings, Egypt, November 4th, 1922. A young boy working for a British excavation team, led by archaeologist Howard Carter, is riding his donkey home one night when suddenly the animal's hoof slips into a hole below the sand. Carter and his team later excavate the site and discover a mysterious chamber hidden deep beneath the shifting sands. Peering inside, they lay their eyes upon one of the most incredible archaeological finds in history. A massive treasure trove of gold and ebony artifacts, all laid out before another chamber, guarded by two imposing statues and sealed shut with an intricate combination of rope knots and clay. The long-lost tomb of King Tutankhamun.
It was absolutely a magnificent discovery. It made headline news all over the world and really sort of captured public imagination at just the right time. Unlike most of the other tombs that had been discovered of the ancient Egyptian pharaohs, King Tut's tomb was untouched. It had not been plundered, it had not been destroyed. And so there's a tremendous wealth of archaeological data, as well as just a stunning display of artifacts.
After spending nearly 3 months cataloging the more than 5,000 relics found within the tomb's antechamber, on February 16th, 1923, at just after 2 o'clock in the afternoon, members of the press gathered to watch Howard Carter finally break the seal protecting King Tut's burial chamber, which had lain undisturbed for more than 3,000 years.
Carter started excavation of the burial chamber within Tutankhamun's tomb, and he found the intact burial of Tutankhamun, which was contained essentially within 9 protective layers.
The sarcophagus is very elaborate. It's got gold. It's inlaid with precious stones. And there's several layers of it before you get down to the central layer, which is, of course, the mummy of King Tutankhamun himself.
Once Carter began unwrapping the mummy of Tutankhamun and removed the funerary death mask and made his way through the different mummy bandages and the bundle itself, he was able to see the face of Tutankhamun, which hadn't been seen by any living person for nearly 3,500 years.
So in a way, the opening of the tomb of Tutankhamun is a kind of a resurrection. Because you see, if somebody in Egyptian belief is forgotten, if the name of him is not mentioned, people don't know about him, he's dead. In Egyptian terms, people after the death, they only keep living as long as they are remembered.
The discovery of King Tut's mummy launched an international media frenzy, making headlines in every major newspaper around the world. But Howard Carter and his team had barely begun enjoying their success when several strange things started happening to them.
And that evening, Howard Carter is having his dinner and hears a commotion in the next room. Goes in, and his pet canary is being attacked inside its cage by a king cobra. Now, the king cobra is a symbol for the pharaoh. And a canary, the symbolism. The canary is the first to go. The canary is the weakest, and a warning. After that, Lord Carnarvon, the financier of the whole expedition, was there on site. And then, while they're inventorying the treasures, he gets a mosquito bite. A few days later, accidentally nicks the bump with his razor. The bump gets infected. It leads to blood poisoning, and he dies of it. A prominent British radiologist came out to the site to X-ray King Tut, and shortly after handling the mummy, he catches a mysterious disease that cannot be diagnosed, cannot be treated, and it kills him.
All told, the deaths of no fewer than 7 members of Howard Carter's expedition took place shortly after the reopening of Tutankhamun's burial chamber. While it was certainly possible their untimely deaths were nothing more than coincidences, many believed that by disturbing King Tut's mummy, the archaeologists had somehow triggered a deadly curse.
To the ancient Egyptians, death was not the end. But in order to guarantee yourself eternal life, you actually had to preserve your earthly body for the spirit to be able to function properly.
The idea of a mummy curse is to keep those people out of the tombs. The Egyptians said, if you bothered these mummies, you would have a problem. And people who have discovered those tombs actually ended up dying weird ways. If that's not a curse, what would be?